You can start in 3, 2, 1. Something smaller, something you could make money on, something accessible, and something that would promote MV Agusta. However, at that time KTM also started getting involved with MV Agusta, and they gave a firm no. At first I thought that the reason for the no was that it just wouldn't be proper for a motorcycle with such a somewhat Chinese origin to be part of MV Agusta's lineup. And that those were the motivations, but I found out that wasn't the case. The point was that KTM had ties with CF Moto. And here note, it's QJ Motor, so basically we have a motorcycle very similar to the Benelli TRK 502 and TRK 702. Because, pay attention, this is a 557, over there we have a 707, so this is a 550 engine, the same engine that recently ended up in the Benelli Tornado and in this new Benelli. Huber Zawieja was at that test. Here, it's the engine from the TNT 702, TRK 702. The chassis is also similar when it comes to the frame and the swing arm, but the suspension is different. And the overall styling is completely and utterly different from those original classic Italian Chinese motorcycles that we've seen before. So it's a bit of a international project. It is mostly Chinese, that's true. Isn't the brand Spanish? And what's interesting? What's interesting is that Rieju, despite cooperating with Chinese manufacturers, hasn't given up its own production. On the outskirts of Figueres, they produce high-performance two-stroke enduro bikes, which our Dominic Olsovi races in Enduro GP. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood of apartment blocks, houses and cafes, there's yet another factory, right in the town of Figueres itself. There you'll find the offices, a mini museum and production lines for electric motorcycles and the Rieju 125. We were given a tour there as well, and indeed, production is in full swing there. Maybe not on the scale we usually imagine when we think of a stereotypical factory, because there are no foundries, milling machines, lathes or other equipment we typically associate with such a place. Instead, there are all kinds of welding robots, paint shops, assembly lines, test benches and other sections necessary for assembling motorcycles. This is more or less what a motorcycle factory looks like in the world of modular automotive manufacturing, where, for example, the suspension is supplied by Pajoli, the engine by Minarelli and the wheels by Morad. Forgings, frames or subframes also come from another company, but they are welded and painted on site. Contrary to appearances, nowadays for a relatively niche brand like Rieju, this is truly exceptional, literally. Practically every brand of this size, like Moto Morbidelli or Benelli, is now in Chinese hands and produces motorcycles that are 100% Chinese. However, Rieju has been owned by the same family since 1942. Today, the head of the supervisory board is the founder's great-grandson, and they still produce modestly but without debt in their own way, and at least it seems that they are dealing with the Chinese on their own terms. I hope they can stay in this situation as long as possible, and the heroes of this film, that is the Xplora family, are supposed to make that possible for them. Good morning, I warmly welcome you, especially fans of genealogy and family trees and topics like that. Why? Well, we're going to start with a bit of the brand's history. The Rieju brand, which has just released two motorcycles, the Xplora 557 and the Xplora 707. Well, Rieju, or as some people in our country say Rieju, was founded in 1942, and to this day it hasn't been sold to any other corporation, the Chinese haven't bought it, no bank has taken it over, and so on. It has always remained in the hands of a single family, and as far as I know in Europe at least there is only one other brand that has achieved something like this. That brand is Beta. Worldwide, I don't want to speak for what's happening in the Far East, but it's definitely a global phenomenon, you have to admit. Especially nowadays, since all those smaller brands have been bought out by the Chinese. However, the Chinese have also had a bit of a hand in this, and in fact, you might recognize these motorcycles. Yes, both from the side and from the front. If you recognize them, that's very good that you do. You probably also remember that this was supposed to be an MV Agusta. More precisely, it was supposed to be an MV Agusta. Lucky Xplora 550. This was done in cooperation with QJ Motor, a concept was shown and so on, but at some point someone from KTM, actually Stefan Pira himself, said, "No way." It's impossible for an MV Agusta to be created in such a form. At first I thought it was about the fact that MV Agusta couldn't be Sinicized, made Chinese, and that it was about ideological reasons. But after all, this is big business, so what was I really expecting? Ideological reasons. It was strictly about money because KTM was working with CF Moto, so it would be hard for them to operate with QJ Motor as well. And so the project was put on hold, basically shelved for a while. And QJ Motor came to Rieju, at least that's how the story goes, and said, hey, we've got these bikes, do you want to produce them under your own brand? And Rieju said, sure, let's do it. Because Rieju, in case someone isn't entirely familiar with this particular brand, let me take a moment to explain. It's a brand that has truly specialized, indeed it has really truly specialized in this specific and important field. In producing small displacement motorcycles, like those 150cc ones. Back when I was a kid, I used to drool over the Rieju MRT, the Marathon 50 with its two-stroke engine, an enduro bike. You know, back then, the ultimate dream for a 13-year-old was either a Derby Senda or a Rieju, at least for me. It was a premium piece of equipment, especially when it came to the suspension and so on, but it was meant for youngsters. And that's the kind of segment Rieju specialized in, but of course you can't survive just making 50cc bikes and little 5-speed engines. So today they've decided to branch out into other segments. Now there are some nakeds, there's the Rieju Aventura, and now it's time for something that looks a bit more elegant, a little more road-oriented than the Aventura, which has 16 tanks and a 48-liter capacity, no, 40 liters of tank capacity and so on. And that's how the idea for the Xplora came about. Because here you can complain or not, but this Chinese development has given smaller, traditional manufacturers a chance to enrich their portfolios a bit. Because I even asked the question, is there a chance that since companies like Rieju or other brands will start to develop after introducing these Chinese motorcycles, is there a chance that something will be created by them from scratch, from a blank sheet of paper? Well, they said that generally the costs are 4 times higher, and contrary to appearances, there isn't such a big limitation when it comes to their own specifications. Here indeed, Rieju didn't make any major revolution because they already had a ready-made platform to use, a platform that has already been tested. The platform which turns out to be quite good, and it proves to be not only good in press tests but also in actual use, because what's standing next to me is the Benelli TRK 502 or QJ Motor, I think it's called, the SRK 502. However, here we have a new engine to be proud of. This one bored out to 554 cubic centimeters, also a twin cylinder with a 270-degree crank. This bike is a bit more forward-leaning than the TRK, but this engine is already appearing in Benelli models. The frame, however, is the same as in the TRK. The suspension, however, is completely different, because here we have Kayaba suspension. Other than that, it's a very simple bike, both the 550K and the 707K. There's no traction control, just a basic Bosch ABS. No electronic gadgets at all, basically the only thing you can do is cast your screen. The phone screen uses mirror link, but whether that's useful for you is something you'll have to decide for yourselves. Going back to the similarities actually. There's the Xplora 707 and then there's the Benelli TRK 702. The same engine, exactly the same frame. Very similar in terms of geometry, it's exactly the same. In fact, they even share frames. There are a lot of shared components here when it comes to the construction. However, the riding experience is completely different here, but more on that in a moment. So, this motorcycle basically produces 46 horsepower and some change, but it can be unlocked to around 56. It's restricted because it's homologated for the A2 license. This motorcycle produces around 70 horsepower. Interestingly, they weigh about the same. Here we have 218, here 221 kilograms dry, and that's quite a lot. I would even say it's quite a lot for this segment, but what can you expect really if you've seen the platform from Benelli? Other features these motorcycles share include 4 piston radial calipers. In this case, the entire system is supplied by Brembo, while in this case, the whole system is provided by someone who doesn't want to admit it. What's nice is that here, the Brembo master cylinder is present. And overall, the whole look of this motorcycle is really quite good. It's finished in a sensible, neat way. There aren't any super fancy, over-the-top details, little accents or coatings, etc. These are simple motorcycles, looking tidy and in a way that you'd probably trust them. I mean, you look at them and they inspire your confidence. But do they inspire confidence while riding? It depends. If we're talking about... Alright, I'll start with the Xplora. The 707, the bigger one, because that's also the one I started riding today, I get on and think, damn, it's actually a big, comfortable motorcycle. It's all right. The engine feels a bit muffled, it's not sluggish, it's not weak, it accelerates well enough, but it vibrates a little. It's kind of like it's being suppressed by something. The handling, well, here's a surprise, because it leans into turns even more willingly than you might want it to. Even though this is a heavy motorcycle, the weight distribution is very good. And the geometry of the whole bike and the suspension setup are such that it leans into turns very willingly. In fact, just as I mentioned, it does so more eagerly than you might want and leans deeper than you might expect. Not that there's anything negative about it, but it does give the impression of a surprisingly light lean in. However, the ease of leaning is one thing. The other thing is the feel of the motorcycle, and that's something I just couldn't find in this machine. It's like as if there was nothing dangerous about it. There was nothing that made me doubt or feel like I couldn't trust this motorcycle in a corner, but there were moments when it would lean in and then it just wouldn't want to tighten up the turn, or it wouldn't straighten up in a sensible way. It just kind of behaved. You know, it's like the handling characteristics were a bit blocky. It lacked that smoothness, precision, and that feeling, because when you get on a well-designed, refined motorcycle, you immediately feel the bike. Better or worse, but you feel connected to it. But I just couldn't get along with this machine at all. I'm not saying it's bad, or that it doesn't handle well, or that it's dangerous, or that it's a motorcycle nobody needs, but I just couldn't really connect with it or form any kind of bond. Because of that, the enjoyment of riding it was just so-so. It was comfortable, dynamic, and so on. It brakes well, the brakes are really nice, the suspension is comfortable and stable, and so on. But somehow I just couldn't find myself on this motorcycle. I don't know if it's because of the 19-inch wheel, although in no other motorcycle have I ever felt such an effect when it comes to having a 19-inch front wheel. But here I had the impression that the front was very strangely weighted and a bit clunky. I had a completely different impression on the Xplora 557. By the way, that specific number 7 at the very end is definitely going to be a characteristic and defining thing for Rieju, because they really want to consistently keep using that particular number 7, just like KTM, for example, consistently has the 1290, 709, NAS 90, just like Benelli has a 2 at the end, and so on and so on. Back to the point. The Xplora 557 is, let me say this openly, simply a cooler motorcycle, plain and simple. It's lighter, more nimble to handle. You can really feel this bike, and that's what's great. You get into a kind of flow with it. It's slower, okay, but with bikes like these, let's be honest, they're not aimed at people who have already ridden around on Africas, GSs, Multistradas, and so on. No one is going to switch to a bike like this, so it's really targeted at beginners, and for beginners, this amount of power is enough. A cruising speed of 130 to 140 kilometers per hour is fine. What's interesting is that this engine vibrates less than the 700, and in general, this machine is better in every respect, even when it comes to riding position. The Xplora 707, as I mentioned, is comfortable, but it has a strange riding position because you get the feeling that your knees are... It's not that your legs slope down gently, but rather as if your knee is a bit above the line of your hip, and here it's kind of bent in a strange way. I couldn't really get used to this position either, because the seat is generally set low. 797 millimeters, I think, at its lowest setting, so it's good for shorter people. However, again, the Xplora 557 welcomed me when riding, and the position felt somehow more pleasant, even though it's the same frame, even though it's... The geometry of the frame is the same, but there are a few small differences in the riding position. I don't know exactly where, but the position is different, just as the overall feel of the motorcycle is completely different. The throttle response is different too, because in the 700C, for example, the throttle has quite a bit of lag. When you close the throttle and want to open it up in a corner, there's this, and only then does it respond. Here that's not the case. Here it responds smoothly to your hand. And generally, because this is a cheaper model, a less powerful model, and theoretically, if you lower your expectations a bit, it's simply better. I would put it this way. In its class, the 557 is already a well-refined motorcycle. Everything works there when it comes to the braking system, handling, suspension, engine, and so on. It works very well. It's competitive with the Honda CB 500, and it's competitive with the rest of the Chinese pack. Overall, it's competitive. The 700 in its category is a rather average motorcycle. It doesn't stand out in any way and doesn't really have any arguments to compete, for example, with something like the V-Strom or the Versys. Maybe it could compete with the Voce DSX 625 or whatever it's called, something like that. Basically, that's the only tier it fits into because it can't compete with branded motorcycles in any respect. Here it's more reasonable, simply put. And you know what? One more thing. Even though I said that overall it's not a bad motorcycle, I'm glad that in the end Rieju took it on because, well, with all due respect, but motorcycles like this just don't really fit with MV Agusta, and even though I'm a liberal automotive enthusiast, I have to admit that MV Agusta and its logo just wouldn't belong here. But as for Rieju, absolutely. It's definitely cool that a brand like this, which does deserve some recognition, because they've done some cool things and have influenced motorcycle culture, at least among teenagers. And they also stick firmly to their plans and resolutions. Bikes like these allow them to create even cooler projects, just like motorcycles such as the Xplora make it possible to set out on more exciting journeys. Strictly for asphalt, because here we also have road tires, Benelli Angel GT at the front. Here we have the Metzeler Touren, so theoretically it's a bit more off-road, but let's be honest, I wouldn't even try to ride this motorcycle off-road. Here, the front rim should also be a 17-inch. Alright. My dear friends, for now I'm wrapping up because I can also hear that my ability to form sentences is slowly running out. The heat really got to us today, plus eating very late and not getting enough sleep, because honestly this trip was a bit of a crazy rush for me. It took its toll, so you'll find out more in the magazine and online. Alternatively, I might still record something fresh as a voiceover. And honestly, I do feel obliged to add a few more words. First and foremost, what's worth paying attention to is this. Despite having a very similar construction to the Benelli TRK 502 and 702, these are not exactly the same motorcycles in different packaging. Sure, the base is almost identical, but the suspension makes a noticeable difference. The Kayaba used in the Rieju works a bit more smoothly and quickly than in the Benelli. It's simply a bit stiffer, but at the same time very comfortable. Its ability to absorb bumps, whether big or small, is at a high level. Although it must be admitted that the engineers didn't fully utilize the potential of the Kayaba, as it can work even more smoothly, despite its rather simple design. Still, compared to the Benelli, the Kayaba gives the Xplora a lighter handling feel, especially when it comes to the 557. Unfortunately, in the 707 something went wrong with the overall tuning, and as I mentioned, the satisfaction of riding this motorcycle leaves much to be desired. So my definite favorite was the smaller model, because in this case, smaller turned out to be better in every respect. The riding position was more intuitive and comfortable, wind protection is at a high level, and even the lower powered engine specifications were sufficient for an enjoyable ride. The engine is eager enough at low revs to move efficiently around the city or exit corners dynamically. You can't complain about highway cruising either, as the comfortable travel speed is around 140 km per hour. At that speed, the engine runs at relatively low revs and you still have enough reserve for overtaking and similar maneuvers. This makes it a truly solid motorcycle for asphalt journeys, although mainly for solo riding. In my opinion, this is an interesting and well-finished option for touring riders, and overall you could describe it as a Benelli TRK 502, but in a premium version with a slightly more dynamic engine, lighter handling, and a more interestingly designed and finished look. As for the 707, well, I'm not inclined to say that this motorcycle impressed me or that I would recommend it for this or that purpose. The difference in performance is moderate and, in my opinion, not worth the trouble. I simply choose the 557 because it's just cooler, more enjoyable, and more satisfying. In the meantime, thank you very much for your attention. Take care. See you. Bye.